Good evening. This is Miesha Johnson with Starseed Awakening radio show. And I have a wonderful guest today, Grant Cameron. He is going to be sharing a lot of things about how he has done so much in the assistance of the disclosure of the UFO. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about Starseed Awakening. Starseed Awakening here is in Las Vegas, Nevada. I have two groups a month. The first Friday of each month, I have a Starseed Awakening group that works on all of the consciousness that we are working on, our abilities, our wonderful, what we call gifts, but what we know as just part of consciousness that is raising. And then on the third Friday of each month, we have our experience group for people who are contactees and have ET experience and have had the encounters. So it's a private group. What is said there stays there. Also on the internet, I have three groups. Facebook, MK Ultra group for experiencers such as myself that have part of the MK Ultra survivors. And that group is the first Monday, or excuse me, every week on Monday at 2 o'clock. To actually 6 or 7. And then the next group is a kind of a floating group. It's sometimes on Wednesday, it's sometimes on Friday. And that is for experiencers of all different types. The next and last group is for the week is on Sunday, and that is at 11 o'clock. And that is also for experiencers. But I have a lot of European people that is a better time for them, so that's when they join us. So if you want to talk to some people from Europe and hear about their experiences, please do join us, because of course it is all private groups. It is an invite only. You need to be an experiencer, of course, with all of those groups. But go to the Facebook. My Facebook site is Starseed Awakening it's just go to Facebook and Starseed Awakening. And you'll find two groups. One is an experience group. The other word is a Starseed Awakening. So pretty much that is it. Of course, the radio show that we have once a month. And I would like to introduce my esteemed guest. I am so thrilled to have Grant Cameron here. I'm going to just read some information, but there's so much that I have to leave off because he's done so much. So we want to have him go ahead and share that. But Grant Cameron became involved in ufology as of the Vietnam War ended in May of 1975, with personal sightings of objects himself with many other witnesses. He wrote about the flap and published papers about those. He has lectured widely in Canada, Europe, and the United States, and has been on the History Channel, the UFO Files shows, Ancient Aliens, and probably more that I'm not even aware of. He talks about the 1975 Cameron Flap, the Canadian government's early investigation into the flying saucers, UFO disclosure politics, the Rockefellers, UFO intuitive, and the presidential UFO connection. In the past few years, Mr. Cameron has turned his research interest into the involvement and actions of the President of the United States in the UFO problems. He has made UFO trips to the National Archives and most of the various presidential archives looking for presidential UFO material. One highlight in his presidential UFO research was the chance to question Vice President Dick Cheney on his knowledge of the UFO subject. Another highlight of the presidential UFO research from Freedom of Information Act to the White House Office of the Science and Technology, which yielded 1,000 pages of UFO documents from the Clinton administration. So Cameron was instrumental, so you can go ahead and take a look at his website while he's sharing. He has also, I've got some other things I'm just going to ask him about, and when it comes to questions, if you want to ask him questions, come to the chat room here at the station, and we will make sure that he answers those towards the end of the show. We'll open it for questions. And I just want to thank you so much, Grant, for joining me today. And I'm just going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Miesha. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for taking interest in what I'm up to and what I've been done in the past. Your intro goes through what I've done in the past, and I do have a book that's coming out next year on the Charlie Red Star sightings, what got me involved. Um, but my interest has basically shifted away almost not totally from UFOs, but it is shifted quite dramatically since February of 2012. And what happened was in the early years in 1975, as the Vietnam War was ended, and I think that had something to do with it because it occurred near the missile silos, the Minuteman III missile silos in North Dakota. And when I tried to publish the manuscript back then, and what happened was nobody would really publish the manuscript, including the local publisher. And it was a big story here because there was this flap went on for about a year in this small town called Carmen, Manitoba, which is about 35 miles from Winnipeg, where I live, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is about 700,000 people. So it's a pretty big population center. And the local publisher said to me, Mr. Cameron, you may believe in this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers. And that was my rejection letter to get this thing published. And it was at that point that I sort of said, well, okay, sightings is a total waste of time. Nobody really cares what I saw. And I did have some very dramatic sightings. But in the end, it's just stories that you tell your grandchildren when you grow old and gray. Nobody really cares. And all I was really concerned about when the manuscript was rejected was what had I seen. And I saw some stuff up pretty close. I had one that was so close I was going to jump on it. So I was sort of in a situation where I went looking for the answer to who knew what I had seen. I figured somebody had to know, and I was just a young kid at the time. I figured, well, there had to be some professor, some university, some government. Somebody had to know what I had seen. So that was the search I started. And as you went through in the resume, I went to the Canadian government. The early 1950s, I had a guy who had been involved in FLAP, who had worked with my father. And my father was a pilot for the Canadian government and Department of Transport. And the one guy had a sighting. It was nothing unusual in the FLAP area. And he had said to me, he says, well, you know, if you really want to know what's going on with UFOs, you should study what the Canadian government was doing back in the early 50s. I worked with the guy who ran the program. And I said, oh, really? Oh, yeah. And he said, his name was Wilbur Smith, and he was the smartest guy I ever met. He was an engineer, smartest guy, but he was absolutely crazy. He was talking to aliens, and they were landing in his backyard, and I'm going, what? He's talking to aliens? And he said, yeah, they named the alien. The alien's name was Alpha. And I became totally enthralled. I figured, well, this has got to be the solution to this answer. What did I see? And so what I did for about 10 years is I gathered all the material. Wilbur Smith, who had run the program, had died in 1962. But I gathered together all the material from his files, from interviewing his wife, from the Canadian government files, and put that all together. And basically what it came down to is the Canadians basically knew what was going on. They had gone to the Americans. They in the early years, this is 1950, 1954, Wilbur Smith was openly discussing the fact that this was for real. This was extraterrestrial, that he was talking to aliens. He didn't cover this up. And that search, when I got that, I put it out, and some people went, well, that's kind of interesting. And that led to research that we did. One of the people that the Canadians had gone to in the United States through classified channels, his name was Dr. Robert Sarbacher, who was providing some of the material to the Canadians through the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. And Robert Sarbacher was interviewed by Stanton Friedman in 1983. And he confirmed, yes, I had given this information to the Canadians. I don't remember very much about it. I remember giving the interview. And Stanton said, well, what had happened? And he said, well, there was a crash in the West somewhere. And this was 1950, and he had been invited to a series of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was a number of engineers and scientists had been invited out of Washington, D.C. to go to these briefings. Sarbacher said he was not able to go, but a number of people had gone, and he was recalling a number of stories from the Navy office in Washington, D.C. of people describing what had occurred at these briefings. The fact that the aliens were insect-like, that the material was very light, that it was of tremendous significance to the Americans. And Stanton said, "Well, if you weren't there, who was there?" And he named off von Braun. He named off von Neumann, who was a guy who worked on the early computers. He named off Vannevar Bush, who's always been rumored to head the MJ12 project. He named off all these people, and Stanton said, "Well, you're naming all these people who are dead. Is there anybody that still might be alive?" So Robert Saubacher said, "Well, there's this guy. He was a guy in Pennsylvania, had a company like me. He was really arrogant. He thought he knew everything. He went to all the meetings, and he thought he knew everything. The research was done, and it was determined that this was Dr. Eric Walker, who was the former president of Penn State University, who had 14 honorary doctorate degrees, who was chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is the top U.S. military think tank. He was the guy that co-developed the homing torpedo. He did work for Eisenhower on engineering. Very, very powerful guy. First conversation with him, he didn't really want to talk. He said, "I don't talk about this subject." He basically was asked, "The information has come to us that you attended a series of briefings, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, dealing with the recovery of a flying saucer and extraterrestrial bodies." And Walker replied, "I was there, so what?" And so for 8 years, I and a number of researchers, I didn't do the interviewing. I sort of coordinated these group of people who figured they could get Walker to talk. So for 8 years, a number of people contacted Walker, and he basically tried to play cat and mouse. He couldn't hang up the phone. That was the problem. He would talk on the phone, and he would talk around the questions, answer a question with a question. Chased him for about 8 years, and I put out my first book, which was called UFOs MJ12 and the government, which talked about the MJ12 group. It talked about Walker's involvement, what Walker had told us about what was going on, because he was there from the very beginning. He was there in 1947 when this thing started. He knew all the people on MJ12. He knew the key players. And at one point, he said to us, "Why should we change the rules to satisfy your curiosity?" He basically knew what was going on. That led to me going after his files. And what happened, that's how I got under the president's. And his files, some of his files, we were looking for some files from he was the executive secretary of the Research and Development Board, which would have made him basically an assistant secretary of defense. And we were looking for these files, and he had indicated at one point that he might, in his files, that he might have sent these to the Truman Library. So that's when I went to the Truman Library, and I figured, okay, I'm going to find Walker's files. I went there, and his files weren't there. There was a couple of letters to and from him, and little things, but really nothing of significance. And it was at that point I was there, and it occurred to me while I was at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, that the president of the United States is the most powerful guy in the world. And this is the most important subject in the world. If you understand what UFOs are all about, the implications behind UFOs and what's actually behind UFOs, you realize this is the most important story in the world. So the question occurred to me, what does the most powerful man in the world know about the most important subject? And it was that point I asked the Truman archivist, who was helping me do searches and stuff like this. I said, "What have you got on UFOs?" And basically they gave me a few documents. There was really nothing there, which kind of surprised me. There was the documents in 1952. Truman was in office. There was a bunch of overflights of the White House. And what had happened is it happened 2 weeks in a row. The first week they had tried to chase these things, they couldn't catch them. And the rumor, there was a story that had gone through all the newspapers in America that Truman had ordered a shoot down order, that he'd ordered that these things be shot down. And that went across the newspaper, and a bunch of telexes and were sent to the White House, including apparently one which we haven't been able to locate from Albert Einstein. And these were things telling the president, "Don't shoot him down." And according to Frank Edwards, who was the reporter in the 1950s, who was basically like the coast-to-coast guy of the 1950s, he had 10 million listeners across the United States. He said that Einstein had told him, that he told the president, "Mr. President, they've come a long way. If they know how to get here, they'll know how to protect themselves once they
Yeah,
get here.
that's
Don't
correct.
start something. Don't start something you can't finish." And apparently, the shoot down order was canceled. But these were the documents. There was a couple of these telegrams to the president saying, "Don't shoot down the UFOs." And so there was really nothing there, which kind of puzzled me. But Independence, Missouri is very close to Abilene, Kansas. This is where the Eisenhower files are. It's maybe 120 miles. So I drove down the road to the Eisenhower Library, had an appointment there, and I met with the archivists at the Eisenhower Library, and they're all in suits. It's a very sort of formal place, almost like from the period of time. Everybody sort of dresses like that period. Everybody's, the archivists are all dressed up and stuff. And then they do an interview before you go in there to see why you're researching and what you're researching and stuff. And I found out at that point that they only had 5 documents out of 28 million pages of files. And at that point, I said, well, there's got to be something wrong here. I mean, this is the most important subject, the most powerful guy. Something's wrong. There's got to have documents. The president has to have dealt with this subject. And so I spent, I guess, about 15 years chasing around to various libraries. And as you mentioned in the intro, I had a lot of success with the Clintons. The Clintons were very interested, and I actually recovered 2 documents from the out of the 1,000 pages that I got from the Clinton administration when they were still in office. I got 2 pages that clearly show that Hillary Clinton was involved. That Hillary Clinton had, and I showed these when she was running for president in 2008. The Washington Post interviewed me at great length to find out why all these UFO material was coming out of the Clinton library.
Okay.
Fox News interviewed me. Associated Press interviewed me, and I provided them with these 2 documents while Hillary was running for president. That Hillary edited a document from Rockefeller to the president, and that we don't know if the president ever got the letter. But what Rockefeller was doing is he was threatening the White House to say, if I don't get what I want in terms of investigation and stuff, I'm going to write a letter to the President of the United States to demand UFO disclosure. And of course, the science advisor who was dealing with Rockefeller would say, okay, Mr. Rockefeller, hang on, we'll do what you're asking. And Rockefeller said, and if I don't get what I want, I will put a major ad in every major newspaper in the United States requesting UFO disclosure from President Clinton. And this scared the living daylights out of them. So they were going along with him, and they were trying to appease him and stuff. And that's why in the 1990s, the U.S. Air Force reinvestigated Roswell, because they said to Rockefeller, if this cover up is as deep as you say it is, and if it is as classified as you say it is, there is no chance that we are going to get this thing disclosed. Give us one case. We'll go after the one case, and we'll investigate it. We'll get it declassified, and then we'll go after the rest of it. And Rockefeller said, okay, Roswell. And that's why in 1993, the U.S. Air Force started to investigate Roswell. It wasn't because the U.S. Air Force suddenly saw the light and decided that they better start reinvestigating UFOs. It was because they were forced to do it. The president wanted it. And then in 1995, they put out the report and said, oh, it was just a mogul balloon. Don't worry about it. Nothing happened. Nothing, there was no extraterrestrial. And President Clinton saw the report, and he was very angry. And what happened was he went to Belfast, Northern Ireland, and you'll see that if you look on the internet, you go Belfast, Roswell, and Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton is lighting a Christmas tree in Belfast, Northern Ireland, at the end of November in 1995. He's seen the report, and he takes a shot across the bow of the U.S. Air Force. Basically, he's indirectly saying, "I've seen the report. I'm not happy about it." And what he says is, he reads a letter from Ryan, which we cannot find this letter, which it may actually have been made up. The president just made up this story about this Ryan sending him a letter. He said, Ryan, if you're out in the audience tonight, here's the answer to your question. No, as far as I know, a UFO did not crash in Roswell, New Mexico. But if it did crash, and if there were extraterrestrial bodies, the U.S. Air Force didn't tell me about it, and I want to know. And the reason he said that was because the 1995 Roswell report did not mention the bodies. And so Clinton is indirectly saying to the Air Force, you're not talking about the bodies. Explain to me how people are identifying bodies in the crash. And so in 1997, they come out with a final report, and it's called Case Closed, final report, Case Closed. And they say the bodies are these dummies that they dropped, 6-foot wooden dummies with Air Force uniforms that they dropped in 1953 that people confused with 1947. And that's saying to the president, Mr. President, here's the answer to your question. You want to know about the bodies? This is how it explains the bodies. So this is how this cover-up game is played, that even though the president wants the thing out, he has limited power to do it. He may have all the answers himself, but in order to get the answers to the people, that's when the blockades take place. That's when you have classified material. The president is sworn to secrecy as the same as everybody else. So I do this 15 years of chasing the president. And then what happened was I have, and you have your group called Awakening. I have my Awakening. This happens, and this changes my whole career. Everything about UFOs changes for me. I'm busy still chasing around who's got the answer, how did cover up work. I put out a book called UFOs, Area 51, and Government Informant, where I talk about the fact that I believe the U.S. government has actually been leaking stuff into the UFO community. So I write this book, and I basically talk about the Avery. I talk about Bob Emenegger being given all this access in the 1970s to do a film, and about the Holloman Air Force Base landing, and all these different things that how the Area 51 story was leaked out by the government. And so I go all through all this sort of stuff. But it happens in 2012. I'm at the UFO Congress, which I'm sure you've been to. It's the major Congress. There's like 1,000 people sitting in the room, and Colin Andrews is lecturing. And Colin Andrews, for people who don't know, is the guy that invented the term crop circles.
Mhm.
And he had an awakening with consciousness. He
Wow.
the fact that he was an experiencer. He was an abductee from 1957. Uh, Basically, was in a shower one morning. He had not made public the fact that he was an abductee. He's in the shower. He tells the story. He's in the shower, and he gets this voice in his head and says, "You have to come forward and talk." And he said, "They didn't have to tell me about my abduction. They didn't have to tell me about UFOs. I knew exactly what this voice was talking about." And I said to myself, "No, I can't do this. I can't go public. If I do, it's game over." He was this big electronic engineer. He was a scientist. And now he's going to come forward and say he's been abducted. And he said, "I can't do it." And the voice in his head said, "No, timing is everything. You've got to do it now." And at that point, he said, "Well, maybe I think I can do it." And he goes to give this lecture, this famous lecture at the X conference. The
Mhm.
original text of his lecture was to talk about the fact that the U.S. or the United Kingdom had been involved in crop circles, very closely involved, even though they were denying it, and that he had worked with them and he had the documentation. That was the lecture he was going to give to Steve Bassett's X conference. He does not make an announcement to anybody that he's going to change, that he's going to announce that he's an abductee. He goes there, he's about to give the lecture. He's about to go on stage, and a guy comes up. He says the guy looks as human as anybody else. And the guy looks at him, looks as if he's looking through him, and says to Colin, he says, "You know you have to do this, don't you?" And
Wow.
Colin said he was just shocked. And he went up there, and that's when he made the announcement that he was an abductee. And the way he's described it is the way I now describe it. The aliens are playing a chess game, and everybody's a chess piece. You're a chess piece. I'm a chess piece. Colin Andrews is a chess piece, and they're just moving the chess pieces around on the board.
Mhm.
And I've got some new material. I'm going to release a new book where I'm going to talk about this pattern. That everything is basically pattern. And if you start looking at ufology and the history of ufology, because I've been in this since 1975. I mean, I've been in this a long time, and I know that what happened in 1975 does not happen anymore. There are no ground traces. There's no angel hair. The cattle mutilations have sort of died off. Crop circles weren't always around. There's all these different patterns. When you start looking at it, you see that it's not the same sort of thing. There was Foo Fighters in World War II. Then there was green fireballs. Then there was flying saucers. Now there's triangles. It's moving. It's like they're as Shakespeare said, who I hated when I was in school. I hated Shakespeare, and now I quote him. Shakespeare said, "All of life's a stage, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women are but actors. They have their entrances and they have their exits, and each man plays in many roles." And then that's the way I sort of look at ufology now. So Colin has this awakening, and he gives this lecture, and this is February the 26th. It's an important date, February the 26th, 2012. He's in Phoenix, and if you've been to Congress, you know that it goes from 8 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night. I mean, it
Yes.
goes on. So you don't go to every lecture. You
Yes.
sometimes you go out for lunch with somebody. So Colin is lecturing, and I'm deciding, no, I'm not going to go to this lecture. I figure, nah, I'm really not that interested. I'm really not interested in crop circles or anything. And then
Right.
I thought, well, he's a distinguished guy. He's been in the field a long time. He's a pretty famous guy. I should pay him the honor, and I should go watch him lecture. So I sit
Mhm.
in there, and as I tell people, in 2012, I could not have given you the definition of consciousness, and I wouldn't have cared. Could not have cared less, and that was the farthest thing from my mind. So the lecture is called "Crop Circles and Consciousness."
Wow.
I go into this lecture, and this is exactly the same day. I don't know if you ever had Chris Bledsoe on your show. Chris Bledsoe is a famous experiencer from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Warner Brothers is about to do an $80 million movie on his experience. Dramatic, one of the most dramatic stories of all times when it comes to UFO encounters. And so it's exactly the same day. Part of his experience was he had the UFO experience. He went public for a little bit. He was ostracized. He was in a community where it was all either Southern Baptists or Pentecostals. He was thrown out of the church for dealing with the devil.
Oh.
Nobody in his town would talk to him, and he shuts up. He doesn't talk. On exactly the same day, February the 26th, 2012, Chris relates an event where he comes in contact with what he calls the shining lady. Now, he interprets this as an angel, as a biblical type figure, and the aliens take him to outer space and they take him to this woman, the shining lady. And this happens February the 26th. I said, "Are you sure it was February 26th?" He says, "Yeah, I'm sure, pretty sure it was the day we were going through the calendar. And it appears it was the same day as I have my experience." And what happens is he hasn't talked for about 4 years about his experience.
Right.
And he goes there, and the woman is sitting up on a ledge in outer space, and the aliens bow down to her, and they leave, and they go into the darkness, and he's standing there in front of this woman he calls the shining lady, and she says, "Chris, you have a burden, and it is yours to carry." And I said to Chris, I said, "Do you know what the burden is?" He says, "Yes, I know what the burden is. The burden is the message. I am to deliver a message to the world." And she was telling me, "You're not delivering the message. You are to deliver the message." Which point he starts to become public again. And then he has a second encounter with her in October of 2012, a second encounter with the shining lady. She reinforces this message. You have a message, and it is yours to carry. And now the message is going to be an $80 million movie. And Julia Roberts apparently is going to be in the movie, and they say it's going to be bigger than The Passion of the Christ, which did
Wow.
$625 million. This is a major Hollywood production on a UFO abduction experience they're not going to twist the thing into evil aliens. So anyway, this happens the same day. So I go into this lecture. This is February the 26th, and my entire life changes. I'm sitting there, have no real interest in what he's talking about, except it's kind of an interesting lecture. He's talking about consciousness and crop circles, and what his theory is that 80% of the crop circles are hoaxed. And he got into a lot of trouble in the UFO community. People said he was working for the government. How could you say such a stupid
Oh,
thing?
yeah.
But he
Sorry.
had Rockefeller, he had money backing him from Rockefeller. And he had used private investigators, and they'd gone. And his determination was that 20% were real, 80% were hoaxes. But the theme of the lecture was that the hoaxes were also being done by the aliens, that the aliens are telling the hoaxer guys what to do. And he presented a number of cases of people who had hoaxed the crop circles, who would tell Colin, "I didn't know how this crop circle came into my head. It just came in my head. I had to go put it down." And at exactly the same time, there's women meditating in the same field, meditating that particular pattern that they wanted put down, and this guy goes and puts the pattern down. So that's his basic lecture, is saying the aliens are running the whole show, that they're getting this message across, they're influencing everybody. And it's during that lecture that I have what I call is a this inspirational download, which is what I basically spend all my time working on now. I'm sitting in the lecture, and for people who haven't had it, I have to explain because it's very important. An inspirational download is different than a good idea. A good idea, you have a good idea, you think, "Oh, that's kind of neat," or whatever. An inspirational download, and a number of people have described it. I've actually written a whole book on this, on whether it comes from music, whether it comes from Nobel Prizes, science. I go through them all, and basically, this is the pattern. This is how inventions take place. This is how new ideas come. It's this idea, and an inspirational download is something that comes like that. It's instantaneous. It's like everything comes into your head at one time. And when you talk about different types of inventions, people will talk about this. The guy that invented the laser, it was like boom, it just all suddenly popped into his head. He'd gone through all the work, done all the thinking, the left brain had done all the analyzing and the gathering of material, but it's the right brain. It's the right brain that's connected to the universe, that actually taps into the universe, taps into the non-local field, and provides the download where people will get it in a dream. The idea of Google came in a dream. Most people don't know this. The idea for the Google thing came in the middle of the night to the guy by the name of Page in a dream. The idea for the computer came in a download. December 1950. The guy had the entire vision, and he built the first computer. So this is the thing. What happened to me is suddenly in my head, I had this boom, instantaneous download where all the information came into my head. And the other thing that's important about a download is you are absolutely 100% certain that it's right. There's no question in your mind. You know this is the answer. There's no question. There's no analyzing. You know this is what I've been waiting for. And what had happened is I had for 37 years, I've been gathering all this material. The Canadian government, Eric Walker, the presidents, all this sort of stuff. I gathered all this material. It was still very confusing in my head. I was trying to figure out how this thing worked. And in an instant, it all came into my head. And it had to do with consciousness, that the basic bottom line to the UFO phenomena is consciousness. And here's what came into my head. There was three main things. And since then, it's just been at a point where I really can't even sort of analyze the material. It's coming so fast from different things where all the right books show up and all the right stuff shows up.
Yeah.
And I'm
Okay.
trying to sort of analyze this stuff. But the three things that came into my head were, and these are things that I'd had all along, but I didn't put them together. One of them, I didn't even know what it meant. One was number one, the Canadian government, 1950. What happened, how the Canadian government got involved, was the Canadian government was working on flying saucers. They never called them UFOs; it was flying saucers, and they believed that there was a propulsion, that the Earth's magnetic field was being used by the flying saucers to propel the flying saucer. And they believed that, well, if we could develop this technology of using the Earth's magnetic field, well, then we can develop this. So what they did on a classified level, they went through the military liaison in Canada, went to the Americans through the Canadian embassy and said, what's the deal on flying saucers? We want to work on this program. We think it's connected with magnetic fields. And the answer they get back is four things. And I've quoted them for years. Number one, flying saucers exist. And this is in a top secret document, which is not disputed by the Canadian government. It's a top secret, it's one of the only top secret documents in the UFO world. It says, we were told by American officials, not people on the street, American officials is the word they use. We were told
Wow.
by American officials, flying saucers exist. Number
Uh-huh.
two, it's the most highly classified subject in the United States, rated 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb would not be
Uh-huh.
tested till 2 years later. Number three, there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush who's
Mhm.
working on the modus operandi. And the fourth thing was, this is of tremendous significance to the Americans. So for 35 years, I run around, I quote this document. The Canadian government knew about this. It's flying saucers exist. The government's known it. They've known all this. The very next line of the document pops into my head at that moment when all this thing pops into my head. And the very next line of the document, this is, you got to remember, this is significant. This is November of 1950. This is before any abductees come forward. This is before any contactees, Adamski, before anybody said they'd talk to an alien.
Wow.
Aliens didn't start talking to people until 1952. So this is 1950.
Mhm.
The very next line of the document says, and we were also told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. And the Americans aren't doing very good because they've said if we're working on it, they're ready to exchange credentials and talk to us. So in 1950, the Americans had told the Canadians that mental phenomena was part of the flying saucer phenomena. Now, how would they know that? No, we now know aliens are telepathic. We know that's the main difference between us and aliens. They're telepathic, but they didn't know that in 1950. So how did they know? And what I'm proposing, the solution to that was Roswell crash. The original story was there was four dead aliens. Now the vast majority of people who tell the story said there was three dead aliens and one live alien. So when the Americans went to pick up the Roswell crash, there was an alien there who was talking in their heads, and they went, "Wow, we got to classify this. If we could talk in someone's head, we could go to Putin, we could go to leaders all around the world and talk to them in their head and give them instructions and tell them we're from God." And they saw the military technology of this mental phenomena. So that's why it was top secret. That's why they were working on this whole thing. And you see in the 1950s, they start working on LSD, they start working on the MK Ultra stuff, and they're trying to unlock consciousness. They're working on this whole consciousness. How does consciousness work? Because they've got a live alien. And they told the Canadians in 1950 that mental phenomena was part of the phenomena. So that pops into my head. The second thing that pops into my head was one of the ones I didn't even know what it was until it popped into my head. Didn't make any sense. As I said, when we were talking to this Dr. Eric Walker with 14 honorary doctorate degrees who ran one of the big Navy labs on torpedoes and submarines and stuff like that, at one point we're talking to him about different things. He's asked a question about MJ12, and he's asked a question by a British researcher and said, what about MJ12? Are there still just 12 people on MJ12, or is it all just Americans still, or is there foreign people? And he said, look, let me ask you a question. And the guy said, what? He said, what do you know about ESP? And the guy didn't have any answer. So Walker answers his own question. And he's talking about MJ12. He's talking about the control group. He says, look, unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in. The MJ12 will not talk to you. Can't be a part of this control group unless you understand how ESP works.
Wow.
Very few people understand it. And it was, and this happened in 1991. I didn't even know what it meant until 2012 when this thing suddenly popped in my head. That's what Walker was talking about. It's something that made sense. And the third thing that popped into my head was Jan Hartson, who was the international director of MUFON now, has this experience in 2000 when he's about 9 years old with his brother in the backyard. They have a flying saucer. It's like 15 feet away or whatever. He goes in to get the camera. He comes back out, whatever, and the thing's gone. And then they go back in the house, and it's 2 hours later. Now, Jan says he wasn't abducted. I think he was abducted. He says, no, just his brother was abducted. But here's this situation where this guy becomes absolutely fascinated with UFO propulsion. He spends his entire life. He becomes an engineer. He's working on the UFO thing. He works his way up to become the international director of MUFON. 1993, there's three people that are in the room. There's Barry Taft. Dr. Barry Taft was in the room. Jan Hartson was in the room. There was a guy by the name of Keller was in the room. These are all people who are interested in UFOs, paranormal phenomena, whatever. And what happens is Ben Rich, who's the head of Lockheed Skunk Works. So we're talking very high level. The Canadian government. We're talking Eric Walker, who was in charge of the part of the cover up, and we're talking Lockheed Skunk Works. So Ben Rich is giving this lecture at UCLA to the engineering alumni. The last thing on his last slide on his lecture, he shows a picture of a flying saucer, and that's when he makes the famous statement: "We now have the technology to take ET home." So everybody goes after the lecture and they start questioning him. And Barry Taft says to him, he says, "Well, is this technology that you developed, or is this technology that you acquired?" And Ben says to him, "What do you think?" And he says, "I think you acquired it." And he said, "Well, you may be right." And then the questions continue, and he says, we now discovered the mistake in the equation. It's going to take an act of God to get this thing out of Congress because it's so deep black. And what happens? He's leaving the room, and Jan Hartson realizes this is his opportunity. His whole life has been obsessed with this propulsion thing. He chases him out of the room, and as Ben Rich is leaving the room to go to his car, he says, "Ben, I've been interested in this my whole life. I'm interested in UFO propulsion. How do they get here? How does it work? How do they work it?" And he turns around and he says exactly to the word what Dr. Eric Walker said 2 years before. He said, "Let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP?"
Yes.
And Jan says I didn't expect a question. He said, "I don't know, what." He didn't know what to answer. So he said, "Well, it means everything in time and space is connected?" And he said, "That's how it works," and gets in his car and drives away. So these things came into my head, and it said, this is basically what it's about. It's the whole mind thing. That's how they move through time and space. That's how it all works. They just have, if we take a look at consciousness, we're looking at this one sort of thin element of consciousness when it's a whole spectrum. In 1840 or 1800, we used to think all we was the reality was what you could see in the visible spectrum. Now we know there's X-rays, there's infrared, there's radio waves, television waves. But in 1800, we didn't believe that. All we said, "No, you're crazy. I mean, there's not that. All there is what you can see." And we now have an idea of consciousness, that consciousness is just what happens in the conscious mind. And there's an entire spectrum. And the only difference between us and the aliens is they know the whole spectrum. So they know how to move through time and space. They know how to see the future. They know how to do telepathy. They know all this kind of stuff. And it looks like magic to us. And all it is they can see the entire spectrum. And we are stuck in this 1800 worldview where we think that all there is in consciousness is what we can see through our eyes and what's coming into our head. And so this is the sort of this revolutionary type thing that sort of just went, wow. And I just sort of gave up on the cover up. I figured, like, I've now got the answer to what I was looking in 1974. This is the answer that I wanted. And I went from there, and it just sort of expanded out to giving a lecture. My first consciousness lecture was at UFO Congress in 2013. I thought I'd invented the wheel. I thought I was the smartest guy in the world. I come to this consciousness conclusion. I was the only one that knew this. And at the end of my lecture, I'm at my book table, and all these mostly women are coming up to me, and they're handing me their books on consciousness. And I'm going, what? And another one on consciousness, another one, and some of them are crying, and they were going, "Oh, finally somebody's got it." Because I was the nuts and bolts guy, and suddenly I'm gone to the woo-woo side. I mean, I was just like totally flipped over and gone to the other side. And I was shocked. All I could think about was I thought I invented the wheel, and suddenly I realized I'd been asleep for 35 years. That a lot of people had figured this out, and suddenly I thought it, had happened to me, and I figured, like, I've sort of, come to this conclusion. And what happened there, and then I'll let you ask a question. What happened there was I had this experience with all these women coming to me in these books, and suddenly realized, like, I've sort of missed the boat here. And then I was told there's this woman out of Phoenix who wants to talk to me. And they said, "Are you still going to talk to her?" And they mentioned her name. I don't want to mention her name was. And I figured, well, man, I must have somewhere agreed to talk to this woman. I don't remember agreeing to this, but I said, yeah, okay. And Stacy runs the UFO group in Phoenix. It's a very big group. And I've spoken there a couple of times. And I was staying at Stacy's house, and she says, "Okay, she's coming over Monday morning. I'm going to work, and you can talk with her." And so I was petrified. I didn't know what was going to happen here. This woman comes to the door with she's an older lady. She's in her 70s. She comes with her partner, and she says, "What did Stacy tell you about me?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm just supposed to talk to you." "That's good." She was walking in. And you've had a lot, like, you run an experiencer group. I have an experiencer group here. And so when you're in an experiencer group, when you deal with UFOs, you hear a lot of weird stories, and you sit there and you listen to them. And sometimes, you're not really, well, I don't know if we're going to buy this one. But so she starts telling this story. She's a remote viewer. She works for the American government and all this stuff. And she's talking away and she goes on. And then all of a sudden she says to me, she says, "Oh, yeah, and last night I was flying the saucer." And I went, "What?"
Yes.
And she says, "Yeah." I said, "You're flying the flying saucer?" She says, "Yeah." I said, "You flew the flying saucer?" She says, "Yeah, I've done it a couple. I've flown three different types. I fly quite often. I've been doing this since I was a child." And I said, "Really?" I said, "How do you fly a flying saucer?" And it was that point she said, "You do it with your mind." And then suddenly I realized, again, I'm sleeping again. This is why they wanted me to talk to her, because they had this connection between. And then from that point on, I have now probably 26 people, and mostly women, who have told me that have flying dreams and they're flying the saucer or whatever. And I always stop them and say, "Hang on, how do you fly the flying saucer?" And they all say it to a word. Nobody has ever said anything different. They all say the same thing. You do it with your mind. And so I use this in my lecture now. I say, you have this discussion between the good aliens and the bad aliens. And I say, look at it this way. If there's bad aliens out there, why are they teaching people to fly flying saucers? What, do we taste better if we know how to fly the flying saucer? And secondly, if you're a woman on Earth, we think we're the elevated race. On Earth, if you're a woman from Saudi Arabia, you cannot, it's illegal for you to drive a car. But if you're a Saudi Arabian woman and you get abducted by the aliens, they're not let you, not only, you don't need a license, you don't need insurance, they'll let you fly the flying saucer. So, I mean, this whole idea that they are doing this kind of stuff. They are teaching people to fly the flying saucers. They're teaching kids to levitate stuff, which you'll hear in these experiencer groups. And the other thing that I've been working on now, and I'm actually, I think I'm going to agree to be on a group. I don't know if you're familiar with the Free organization, this Edgar Mitchell's group.
Yes, I am.
They've got 300 people who have answered the first part of this sort of questionnaire.
I
Now
did.
now you're right. Okay, so
Yeah.
and I encourage anybody who's listening to do this, because this is a major study that they're doing. They have 300 people have answered already, and what you're doing is looking for these similarities. And I'm looking for the one that I'm going to be questioning people on out of their survey in stage 3 that I'm going to volunteer for, and that is that I know that they've got people who are getting downloads of scientific material, and that there are a lot of business guys, and Bigelow was one of them, who is following around experiencer people because these people are getting downloaded stuff. Now the question is, why are aliens downloading stuff into people? And there's actually an interview that's just taken place. There was actually Brett Oldham, who's from Las
Yes.
Vegas. He's one, and there's another one is Suzanne Chancellor. Now I put them together because I listened to their stories separately, and I suddenly realized they both had talked to the same alien, and they actually agree. The alien is exactly the same. He wears a long robe. He's got this amulet around. He's one of the tall grays, and that they were both shown a mathematical formula. And both of them said exactly the same thing. And this is the strange thing about this mathematics. You can understand maybe the flying saucer, but it's this mathematics thing is weird, because both Suzanne and Brett both said the same thing, where they were shown this mathematical formula on a screen. And they said, "You're wasting your time. I'm not interested in mathematics. It doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not interested." And both times the alien said to them, "When the time is right, you will know what this is." Now, Suzanne was told at one point, now she wasn't showing it in relation to the formula, but she was told, the alien was talking to her about cancer, and he says the cure to cancer is something you use every single day. So she's shown the formula and she's told about cancer. Brett is very specific. When he says, "No use showing me the formula. It's total waste of time. I'm not interested." The alien says it's the cure to cancer. And he said, "Well, let me write it down." And they said, "No, you can't write it down. You can just look at it." So here you have this situation where people are being downloaded mathematics for whatever particular reason. There's something going on here that we are sort of being aided. And that's where it comes down to this idea that I have, that Colin Andrews has, is this idea that people are just chess pieces and we're being moved around. And that if you see a UFO, you're part of the game. Like people will say, "Oh, I saw a UFO, but I'm really not an experiencer." And I say, look, when they abduct people, you don't see them. Nobody sees anybody being abducted. There's no crafts. You don't see people going up into the craft like that. So when the aliens want to cloak themselves, nobody sees them. Therefore, if you see a UFO, if it comes down and hovers in front of you for 5 minutes and then flies off, you're meant to see it. You're part of the game. If they want to see you to see it, that's why they do it, is because they want you to see it. Why do UFOs have lights on it? They have lights on it. We don't need lights on our planes. They have lights on the craft so you can see it. They want you to see it. You're part of the game. And so my whole thing in ufology has changed now to this idea of this consciousness thing. And once I got to this consciousness thing, it was suddenly like download city. It was like, boo, these books and the free people coming up and talking about the mathematical downloads. And then Ray Hernandez, who started free, talks about his download. He sees me lecture in he comes to me because I'm doing the consciousness thing, and he says my wife and I are interacting with this alien, with this craft, and we are able to bring this thing, and I need to know what's going on. It's driving me nuts. He was only sleeping 2 hours a day. He was reading books on near-death experience and consciousness and quantum physics, and his wife said he'd lost it, and he's coming to me and saying, well, what's going on? We're in contact with this alien, with a ship or whatever, and I need to know how this thing works. I said, I'm lecturing in Florida. And so come down, we'll have a talk. You can hear my lecture on consciousness. He comes to the lecture. It's the only UFO conference lecture he's ever gone to. 3 days later, he gets the download. He's driving in traffic in Miami, huge traffic jam, and suddenly he says he sees the vision, and it's like the Wheel of Fortune, and this thing, he hears the voice, and the voice is saying it's all connected, in the UFOs and the near-death experiences and consciousness, and all these things are all in this wheel's turning, and the girl who started the experiencer group um, out of Maine had exactly the same vision. So you see this sort of situation where people are being led, people are being moved around and chess pieces, and that it's something where we're being aided. That's my basic conclusion to this whole thing, and that I'm part of the game. I now see it as if this is part of the game, and now I just sort of open up and I say, okay, I'm on a horse. I'm a blind guy. I'm sitting on a horse. Wherever the horse is going, that's where we're going. And you just go, and then things start to work. Everything starts to fit together, and all you get these synchronistic type things where pieces start to fit together. And so that's basically a long answer to where I am now, and you may have questions related to that. And I think you're working on the same thing, because I say people like you, like the people who are running experiencer groups, when it comes to sightings, I say, and I've discovered this since 1975, that sightings is a waste of time, because you cannot tell what is going on by counting how many fast ones, how many slow ones, how many green ones, how many. The only way you can find out what's going on is to talk to somebody who, like Travis Walton, came down from the skyscraper, seeing these little things moving around on the top of the skyscraper, and went down and jumped out in front of one of them and flagged it down and got on board the ship. So it's the people who have been on the ship, who have claimed to have contact with the people in the ship. That's the only people we should be talking to, because they are the closest people to having the answer as to who's behind this phenomena, why are they here, and what is their intention.
You know what? I have just chills running through my body. I got to tell you, because for years I've been in this since 1992, and well, actually 89 actually is when I was at UFO Contact Center International. I was the director for the Nevada, and I've been waiting for this to happen, for the researchers and the experiencers to join together in the consciousness that we can give to each other, what information that you can give the researchers can give to us, and what information the experiencers can give, because the main thing is consciousness, and in all of our experiences, it's all telepathic. It's all experiences where, I've been on board a ship. I know what you mean about the flying thing. It's all no hands on. It's all thought. It's amazing that it has come to this now, that consciousness has raised so much in our world, that now these two groups that have been a bit divided in the past, as you would agree, are now together. I love it. I love it.
And one of the analogies,
I was really impressed when I heard what free was about. At first, I was thinking, oh, what are you going to think about us experiencers? What's going to happen? I went ahead and answered it, and then actually he wants to talk to me. I just have been real busy catching up, and I need to talk to him because
Ray is a guy that you should have on your show. Ray is the one person that I've met in ufology who's more obsessed, crazier than I am. I mean, this guy is he was sleeping like 2 hours a day. He read hundreds of books, and then he said, "Oh, I got to give you some of these books." And he sent me this when we first got involved, like a couple of years ago. He sent me this little disk drive with like 100 books on it, and I'm going, Like I spend the rest of my life reading these books. He's just obsessed with this thing. I was meeting with him in at the conference, and his wife, where he's trying to get his wife to tell the story because his wife has some really dramatic sightings of seeing these Wembley type objects, huge objects over top of the house and stuff. And they have this cure of the dog and stuff like this, where it starts. He's an atheist, he's a materialist atheist and stuff like this. And his wife has this incident with the dog gets cured, and the dog is paralyzed, and they're ready to put it down the next day, and she takes it to carries it outside to go to the bathroom, and suddenly this UFO, this small object appears in the room and stuff like that. She believes it's angelic type thing, and he comes down and figures this is a total waste of time. What's going on? And goes back to bed. And so his story is just like a wild story of this sort of being dragged into this thing. And now, I mean, this guy, his whole life, and his wife even said when we were at the conference, she says, "Oh, you talk too much about this," and she just waved at him and left the hotel. She didn't want to tell me the story because she figured like you're crazy. And he's like really the driving force behind this whole thing. And he talks about the synchronistic thing about how Edgar Mitchell got involved, and Rudy Shield, and John Climo, and Whitley Strieber, and it's just on and on. The group of people that they've got, and the all the papers that they're producing, all the scientific papers on quantum physics and consciousness. And that, if you look at their main website, that's part of what it's about. Is one of the tabs is consciousness, one of the tabs is quantum physics, and so they're linking all these things together, and the experiencer thing. So there's a guy that to me just sort of exemplifies this experiencer thing that's starting to mushroom, and the way he described it I think is accurate. We are the gays of the 1960s, and we are the closet people who have started to mobilize. You're getting these experiencer groups. For example, we've had one here in Winnipeg. When I saw the ones that were running at UFO Congress with hundreds of people at the time, everybody trying to get into these experiencer meetings, we started one here, and there's more and more of these experiencer meetings happening all the time, where you can see it's like the gays there's people are starting, the experiencers are starting to form into groups like gays did in the 1960s, and they're starting to become more public, and you're starting to get these support groups for experiencers, and you're going to get to a situation. And I say, I don't really care what the media writes. I don't care. Consciousness works to me. We are no different than any other social and political movement. And whether it's the African American movement, whether it's the gay movement, whether it's women's right to vote movement, where any of these movements, what it is, it's the same sort of thing where you raise the consciousness, and then at one point, and I actually heard Rush Limbaugh say this. I'm in the United States, and I actually heard him say it. He says, "Okay, that's it. Give it to him. Give it to him. Gay marriage, they've got it. Give it to them." And I went, "Wow!" It's like,
Wow.
consciousness has moved. That the most conservative guy has suddenly given up, and then it just moves on. And everybody goes, "What's the problem? Like what?" And I think it's going to be the same thing. That I don't care if the movies do it bad, if there's bad articles, bad things said. The more we talk about this issue, sooner or later, 90% of people are going to be thinking about the issue, and people will make the right decision. They will say, these people are right, this is right. The same as they decided that gay, you didn't have to be executed because you were gay, or blacks weren't satanic, or women should be voting, or we shouldn't have slaves. I mean, all that eventually, when you get a high enough number of people talking, they suddenly realize, well, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to have slaves. And the same
Right.
thing's going to happen in our field, that people are going to suddenly realize these people are right, this is actually going on, and everybody's just going to sort of go along with it.
Absolutely. It is. And that that's a very, very good point. That will also change everything. We have like 6 minutes, and then we're going to go for a break. So I have a
Well, let me.
question. Oh,
Okay,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, no,
No,
if you have
no.
something to add.
On this thing of the pattern, this is something I only discovered in the last couple of days, and this is where it shows how these synchronicities work together. Um, what I think could be going on is that all of this is just to carry a message. There's a guy by the name of Shermer who was abducted in 1967. He was a police officer. He was one of the first abductees. It was Betty and Barney Hill. Then there was the Shermer guy in '67. And when he was regressed, one of the things that he said the aliens told him is, we want you to know about us, but just a little bit. And what I think a lot of the UFO thing is breadcrumbs. It's messages. It's just them dragging us along and giving us messages. They're not directly telling us what's going on. They want you to figure it out. So they're sort of dragging us along. And so you take a look at the whole idea. You and I talked about this when I was in Las Vegas. I was seeing your show on the various paintings and stuff like that. We were talking about this thing about the music influence, the rock stars being influenced and stuff like that. And it came to this whole idea that they're sort of just dragging us along, and that there's all these messages, the message of the oneness of the universe they want, the message that we're destroying the environment, they want us to stop nuclear weapons. All these messages are coming out. In the last couple of days, and this is a book now I'm looking for, there's a theory, and as I said, there's these patterns where you have in the 1890s, you have these wooden ships. Then it turns to Foo Fighters. Then it turns to green fireballs. Then it turns to flying saucers. Then it turns to triangles. So you have this sort of progression,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea is that they're just moving these things along and changing this scenario, and it's actually they're just dragging us along towards a raising of consciousness. One of the things that came out was the fact that in the spiritualism happened the same way. UFOs basically started in World War II when we detonated the atomic bomb. Suddenly, all these UFOs appeared, and the whole thing started.
Yes.
Spiritualism, if you look at the history of spiritualism, it started at the same time. It started in 1840, and most of the women, this is there's an actual book written on this. Most of the women who were in charge of the most of the no women ran the spiritualist movement that started in the 1840s. And if you remember back, Lincoln's wife was doing seances at the White House and stuff like this.
That's
This
right.
started, and that's when the whole spiritual thing, talking to ghosts, channeling, psychics, all this started in 1840. And the thing was that this book makes the point that the women that were in charge of the spiritualist movement were in charge also of the end to slavery, of women's right and emancipation movement started in 1848. That the major movements at that time that were started to raise consciousness were started by these people in the spiritualist movement, which seems to indicate the same thing as the alien thing, is that you have these spiritual forces who say, okay, now is the time. Let's do some ghost stuff. Let's do some stuff. Let's get this going, and everybody gets going. And in behind it, there's this message raising the consciousness towards ideas about we shouldn't have slaves and women should be allowed to vote and all this kind of stuff, where there's an underlying message that's being carried along. And it may not be that we're looking at the flying saucers. There may be this background message, which is the whole point of the thing, that they're raising our consciousness on various issues such as gay rights and equality, and particularly the oneness of the universe, which is a big one that I have now. You have the separation of the world, where you believe it's a random world with no meaning, or you believe it's oneness. And that to me is a critical idea that they're trying to get across. This idea that we're all one, and we got to quit trying to destroy other people on the earth. That we're all one, we're part of the thing, and that if you realize everybody's one, you're going to stop the wars, you're going to stop all this kind of stuff. So these are the kind of issues and messages that the musicians are bringing out, the aliens are bringing out, and there's this behind the scenes game of getting messages out that I seriously believe is going on. And you see these patterns all the time.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. One of my songs that I play, I'm not sure that they got it tuned up for today, but is Muse's Revolution. And that's what
Ah,
it's about. It's all about that, all about, the mines are being wrapped in green belts of,
yeah,
money. And that if we could understand how conscious basically we are, and could really understand our third eye and all of that, that we wouldn't be afraid to die,
yeah,
because we are eternal spiritual, and spiritual beings having a human life, so it's
yeah,
very, very, very important that this is coming out now. And it's not by accident. I absolutely, when you talk about whether things are angelic or they're ET, it doesn't really matter,
yeah,
because they're all one.
yeah,
They're all one. The astral travels. There's so much going on in my experience groups with people having either astral traveling and going to I can't think of the name of it, but a parallel existence, a parallel Earth,
yeah,
lots of parallel Earths, and other planets, and there's so much, because they are connecting with all of the experiencers, including myself. I all of a sudden last year started channeling many galactic languages, and they came to me by way of my ET experience with a group of hybrids, actually.
mhm,
And so, and they speak of oneness. They speak of translating the
yeah,
whole thing into love. They
yeah.
talk
Move from
about
fear to love is one of the messages. Yeah,
love, love. Every time
yeah,
all these messages are always about love,
yeah,
and it's wonderful to hear. that, I mean, I haven't been to a convention for a little while because, frankly, they got a little too nuts and bolts for me, and I just wasn't, I wasn't connected to that. So I'm really looking forward to going and hearing how many of the researchers are now.
Since 2012, a lot of researchers are talking about consciousness. The first one I did was 2012, and now Paula Harris had hers in most of the people. A lot of people are talking consciousness. There was a big one in Toronto. Now consciousness is a big thing. They put it on the agenda. Whereas in UFO Congress in years gone by, it was like nobody would go to UFO Congress. It's too much woo-woo stuff. There was too much of this nutty, people talking to aliens and stuff like that, and they wouldn't have it. It's a completely different world since 2012.
Wow, I'm gonna have to. I definitely planned on going to the last conference here, but then I broke my wrist, so I wasn't able to make it. So,
Yeah,
and the one Contact in the Desert, I've listened to some of those, and those are about consciousness as well.
yeah.
Eisenhower before, the now I can't think of her name is, but Eisenhower's great granddaughter.
Daughter,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, she was talking about consciousness tremendously. Years ago, everybody was talking about the fear, and now that fear is being removed and replaced with consciousness. So,
Yeah, yeah, that is in fact that's one of the lyrics in the Moody Blues. There's either Moody Blues or Yes. That was two of the big bands that were real direct ET experiencer type people. It said, take off your cloak of fear and move to love." And that's one of the key messages: is move from fear to love. The basis of the universe is love, and that's basically Beatles. All of them. When you start looking at the music, it's actually it's shocking how many of them have the ET contact
uh,
and ET experiences. So maybe we can talk about that at the rest a
yeah.
little bit because some people know it. It's becoming more popular, but there's even now Merrill Frankhauser is coming out now. He's the guy that wrote the song "Wipeout" in the 1960s. He's just written two songs about the ET signals or the signals from the Malibu, the object under the ocean there. He
Oh,
was sent
yes.
the and he got this inspiration and wrote these songs about it. So you get guys like this. I mean, it's going on all the time. And he actually talked. I had a chance to ask him some questions. He talked about him and John Lennon actually talking about where does music come from, and that's the big
Uh,
book I'm bringing out next year is the whole idea: where do good ideas come from? Where does music come from? And I'm going to maintain that it's coming from the right brain. It's coming from the universe. Nobody invents anything. It's basically all downloaded.
oh, absolutely. I agree completely. Well, we're going to go ahead and go into a little break, and we'll be back in probably about 5 minutes.